Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a pretty cold afternoon here in Washington, D.C. My name's Gordon Gray. I'm the Kuwait Professor of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs here at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. Um, Very pleased to have with us Shadi Hamid, and I'll introduce him in just a second. I want to welcome you all to our first Middle East Policy Forum event of the calendar year. Thanks for your interest in the topic. I'm sorry we couldn't do this in person, but you know that's what happens when it snows like it did. I want to thank the ExxonMobil Corporation for their generous gift to the Middle East Policy Forum, and that support makes events like these possible. I also want to thank two of my colleagues, Christian Clinton and Logan McIntosh, for publicizing the event and also for so adeptly pivoting when we had to make this online only. And before we get to today's event and today's topic, I want to mention the next two Middle East Policy Forum events that we're going to have. Hopefully that will have an in-person, they'll each be in person as well as online. The first one I want to mention will be 2 weeks from today, February 10th, Tuesday, February 10th. My friend and colleague, Professor Sina Azodi, will moderate a panel on U.S.-Iranian relations. It'll be held on February 10th, which is the eve of the 47th anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. And he'll be joined by Barbara Slavin and Alan Ayer, both of whom are, like Professor Azodi, experts on Iran. They followed it quite a long time. And then the event 15 days after that, on February 25th, Ambassador James Jeffrey will discuss his memoir, Middle East Crises. Both those events will have both a online and in-person option, and both will start at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. But let me introduce Shadi Hamid now. Many of you probably know him from reading his Washington Post columns or from reading one or more of the books he's written. I assigned chapters from his previous book, The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea, to students in my courses, and I highly recommend it. And in addition to being an author and a columnist, Shadi Hamid is a senior fellow at Georgetown's Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. He received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Georgetown, and then was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, where he received his PhD. His book, The Case for American Power, is a provocative examination of the intersection of morality and U.S. Power in international affairs. And I use provocative in the best sense of the word, meaning it makes us examine our premises about U.S. foreign policy, regardless of where we are on the political spectrum. He hasn't pulled his punches in criticizing U.S. foreign policy in his Washington Post columns or in some of his previous books. And in this book, he explains that he just started his freshman year of college when the 9/11 attacks took place. And he calls them in the book a double tragedy for him personally as both an American and a Muslim. And for all these reasons, I think Shadi has a great deal of credibility when he argues for American power. After he gives a few remarks, I'll ask a question or two, and then you'll be able to ask questions by putting them in the Q&A box. Shadi, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for writing the book, and over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Ambassador Gray, for having me. Thanks to the Institute for Middle East Studies. Um, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks to all of you for coming too on this cold day virtually. Okay, let's get right to it. The book's argument is in the title. It is not necessarily the case for American power as much as it is a case for American power. My case, the case that I'm making, which is probably different than the kind of book that a Trump supporter or Trump himself would write. But that's also what makes the case a little bit harder to make. Recent events and Trump's distinctive assertion of power on the world stage, I have to kind of offer a disclaimer sometimes that I'm against a lot, if not most, almost everything that Trump is doing these days. So it kind of presents a challenge. How do you make a case for American power when the world can see what the use of American power is leading to under Donald Trump? I've described this book elsewhere as an anguished manifesto. And I think that kind of captures it, that um, I'm I'm struggling with these ideas myself, and I want the reader to walk along with me. I want them to see my own doubts and my own uncertainty. And an editor friend of mine once said something that I like a lot. She said that we write the books that we need to read. So in that sense, I'm in a kind of internal dialogue with myself and almost trying to make the case to myself that despite everything we've seen, despite all the terrible things America has done, is there still a case to be made for American power? And my answer is yes. Before I get into maybe more the heart of the argument, I want to just touch on a little bit of my own personal story. The book is kind of part memoir in a way, because I went through my own evolution over time. Ambassador Gray mentioned that my freshman year of college is when 9/11 happened. I was 2 weeks in. It was the day that changed my life. That's when I decided to go into politics, to be a writer. I knew that I wanted to understand why something like 9/11 might have happened. I wanted to understand why the Middle East had become the way it was. And that became the defining question for much of the last 20 years of my life. But after 9/11, when I was at Georgetown, I was very much in the mode of being a skeptic of American power. And I didn't believe that we could be a force for good in the world. In fact, I thought the opposite, that we were a font of evil and destruction. And it was around that time that I went through my pseudo-socialist phase. I think a lot of us go through it. I was reading Noam Chomsky religiously, and it really did feel like what he was saying was a revelation. And I actually think Noam Chomsky was right about a lot of things, but not everything. And this is where I become a little bit harder to place in the kind of ideological spectrum that, yes, America has done a lot of bad things. Yes, it makes sense for someone at that age to maybe want to be an anti-imperialist. And for me, the anti-Iraq war movement was key, as well as 9/11. And of course, those two events were related, as we know. One wouldn't have happened without the other. And it was in the anti-war movement that I cut my political chops. I organized a die-in to protest the war. We even ended up setting up a small tent encampment at Georgetown in the main square, which is ironically called Red Square for those of you who have been to the campus. And the idea of that encampment was that at least one person was expected to sleep in a tent on any given night, which translated into a continuous presence of over 2,000 hours. We did it until George W. Bush announced mission accomplished. Of course, we know the mission wasn't accomplished, but that seemed like a reasonable time to stop our vigil. In any case, That was an exciting time of my life. I was also very angry. And I think for many of us on the left, we blamed America first and for good reason I mean, the war was one of the great historic blunders, and that's been my position for the last 20 years or so. So that raises, I think, an interesting question. 2 decades later, I'm making a case for American power. What happened to me? So there's a couple things I want to highlight here. First is that millions of people across the globe were opposing the Iraq War. They took to the streets. There was actually a day of coordinated protest that some of you might remember if you're old enough in February 2003. It was really remarkable. But despite our numbers, despite people power, we couldn't stop the war from happening. So I entered into a phase of disillusion. I came to a kind of realization that I didn't want to be on the outside looking in. I didn't want to be one of those protesters outside of the White House every week, feeling powerless. I didn't want to be a protester for the rest of my life. So I decided to not lose faith. I decided that I would try my best to work within the system to effect change for a better, more just foreign policy. So some of this is also about pragmatism, it's about tactics, it's about the question of how does change really happen? And is it better to be on the inside or the outside? But not only did I change, my diagnosis of the problem changed too. And I came to the conclusion over time that power itself wasn't the problem. American power wasn't the problem. Power was a fact. Someone would need to wield it. It was only a question of who and how. And I think the second part of this is important too, that we as citizens of a democracy have a say in how that power is exercised. We get the government we deserve, and I think we also get the foreign policy we deserve too. So what that means for me is that if American foreign policy can change for the worse, then by definition it can change for the better. In other words, just because we've done terrible things in the Middle East in the past doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat those mistakes in the future. So, in that sense, my argument is an argument of hope that there is nothing static and unyielding about American power. It doesn't have to be the way it's been. And I'll talk about Gaza a little bit more in a moment, but if we see US support for Israel as something that will never change, then of course it's hopeless. Then we can say that American power is something inherently bad. But I don't think America has to always support Israel in the way that it has over the past 2 years or the past seven decades. Because we are a democracy, it means that we have input into what our government does. So theoretically, it's possible in 5 years and 10 years, but I would say it's even starting to happen now. If we don't like our country's policy towards Gaza, we should elect leaders, we should elect people who share our vision of a more balanced foreign policy on Gaza and on the Middle East more broadly. That is something that we have a say in. Okay, so let's just bracket that. What also became clear to me as I kind of evolved over time, and I would say especially over the past 10 years, as we saw the rise of, as we have seen the rise of China and Russia as competitors to the American project, that in some ways there is an alternative to U.S. power, but the alternatives are worse. And again, we're talking here about China and Russia. Obviously, there's some other powers that we kind of include in the list of challengers to US dominance, but the primary ones we normally talk about are China and Russia. So there are potential alternatives, but we have to ask ourselves the question, do we think those alternatives are preferable to what we have now, which is American dominance? Now, you might say there's another way of looking at it, which is to compare America to an ideal, to a morally perfect superpower. But that hypothetical, morally perfect superpower doesn't exist. So I'm not a big fan of imagining America as, let's say, a giant NGO with an air force or a human rights organization. We're not going to act in this kind of pure manner. We're not going to act like Amnesty International because we are a country that has national security interests. There will always be a tension between short-term interests and long-term interests. There will always be a tension between hard national security imperatives and ideals. Now, I don't think the gap is as large as most policymakers think, and I don't even like presenting it as a binary, but I'm not going to pretend that our ideals and interests are always 100% aligned. And I'm saying that here because I think that is a concession to reality. It's a concession to pragmatism that we have to compare America not to something that doesn't exist, but to the available alternatives. Now, let me grant the premise that a Chinese dominated world, let's say that some of you in the audience think that a Chinese dominated world would be better. Let me just poke a couple holes into that premise because that is the argument that we often hear that the alternative could potentially be better. We don't know. We haven't tried it. The problem there is that it's not actually a realistic alternative. It's unlikely that China will overtake the US for the foreseeable future on any number of metrics. And what that means is that for most of the rest of our lives, depending on how old we are, we won't actually see a Chinese dominated world. That's not actually all that realistic. In the book, I have a chapter. I won't go into all the reasons behind why I say that, but in the book, I do have a chapter on the rise of China. I argue that the rise of China has been wildly overstated, and that China, because it is something close to a totalitarian regime, has deep structural weaknesses. And this gets into some of the arguments I made in my previous book, The Problem of Democracy, where I go into some of these key differences between democracy as a regime type and autocracy as a regime type. Now, under authoritarian regimes, they can seem strong for a while. When the leader is smart and wise, then the leader might make smart and wise decisions, and it seems like it might work, right? But when the leader starts making mistakes in an autocratic context, citizens have no avenue for redress. There are no means for self-correction. The means for self-correction are really only there in a democracy. That's a feature of democracy, that we make mistakes, and because we have parliaments, because we have Congress, because we have checks and balances, we can actually realize what our mistakes are and then correct for them. So in this sense, the title of my book can be read more as a descriptive statement than a normative one. Even if you don't think American power should be, then you can at least maybe agree with me that American power is. And it's unlikely to change anytime soon, as I mentioned. So if American power will remain uncontested for most of our lives, then we're left with really only one option, in my view. And that option is to try to improve the exercise of American power. There is, I guess, another alternative. I don't think it's an appealing one, which is to give up on America altogether and to say that America is hopeless, America is beyond redemption, and that let's hope, even though it's unlikely to happen, that China will gain ground. Let's hope maybe in something resembling a multipolar world. But what we've seen, I think, when American power is perceived to decline, it emboldens competitors. It emboldens countries like China and Russia. They step into the void. We have more chaos. We have more conflict. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine is probably the primary example of that. But we can even look at the Obama era and thereafter, where there was a perception that America was in decline. And we saw the chaos that we saw of civil war and proxy warfare in the Middle East, for example. So that's the kind of descriptive argument. I also want to make the argument that not only is America better than the alternatives, but also that America has at times been a force for good in ways that we usually take for granted. Granted, most of that happened in the 20th century, so it can seem like a long time ago. I think a lot of us, in my generation certainly, we came of age in the last 25 years, and the record has been pretty bad for that period. But if we take a longer time horizon perspective, I think the case becomes a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more interesting. At the end of World War II, the number of democracies in the world, only about 8% of the world's countries were democracies at the end of World War II. Going into the 1990s, we reached a peak of close to 53 to 55% of the world's countries being democracies. So it was in America's unipolar moment that we saw the third wave of democratization, which many of you are probably familiar with and from your political science classes, that there was a spread of democracy that coincided with American dominance. What we also see post World War II is battlefield deaths declining significantly. And they reached their lowest point again in the 1990s during America's unipolar moment. We also see after World War II what is sometimes called the rules-based international order that was made up of multilateral institutions that were formed after Bretton Woods. We know the whole list of these international institutions, whether it is the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, the UN. We have these, and they're not perfect, obviously, as we all know, but there was a kind of sense that we would build institutions that would constrain the power of different actors, and America would also agree to constrain some of its own power in the name of the greater good, in the name of this rules-based international order. We also provided the security umbrella that allowed Europe to rebuild, and we paved the way for the establishment of the European Union. It was under America's gaze that these things were able to actually happen. And we saw an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity in Europe. So these are things that we shouldn't forget. Maybe they're almost too obvious and we all know them in a kind of rote memorization kind of way, but they do matter. I would also want to raise several interventions that happened in the 1990s, which again shows that America isn't doomed to always do bad interventions. Just as there are bad interventions, there can also be good ones. So there was helping end the Bosnian genocide in the 1990s. In 1999, there was the intervention that ended the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. And also, there was the first Gulf War in 1991, where it was only American power that could stop Iraq's invasion and occupation of Kuwait. So, those are three important examples that should dismantle this idea that we often hear that America is incapable of doing anything good in its interventions abroad. Grant, again, that was then, this is now. And I want to just bring this back to Gaza. Gaza looms over all of this. And over the last 2 years, I've questioned my beliefs and commitments once again. And I have had a bit of a crisis of faith in America. And as I was writing parts of the book and revising in 2024 and last year, there were moments where I thought to myself, do I really want to make this argument knowing what America is facilitating in Gaza? And that's something I've been very critical of. I was one of the first people in a major mainstream newspaper to lay out the case for why what Israel was doing in Gaza was a genocide. That piece came out in the Washington Post last May, if some of you want to look to what I said then. And I think for me and so many others, Gaza felt like a breaking point. But again, I want to emphasize the point here that this unquestioning support for whatever Israel does is not a structural reality. That is a product of our democratic process. And if enough of us say that we don't want America to have this unquestioning support for Israel, then it is within our power to change that. And I often think of, in this context, I often think of Gandhi's famous quip. And it does relate to my book. I think in a broader sense, he was asked by a reporter what he thought of Western civilization. He allegedly replied, "I think it would be a good idea." Similarly, I very much like the idea of America. But the gap between what we say we believe in and what we actually do can be quite large. We have a problem with hypocrisy, and we have been profoundly hypocritical. So I want to end on this kind of meditation on hypocrisy, which is a little bit counterintuitive, which can maybe help illuminate where I'm coming from. In the book, I have a whole chapter on hypocrisy, and I argue that hypocrisy, seen from a certain perspective, can actually be a good thing. The French author Francois La Rochefoucauld has a famous maxim where he observes, hypocrisy is the homage that vice pays to virtue. In other words, what does that mean? To be seen as hypocritical is the cost of trying to be better than you actually are. Or to put it differently, insofar as hypocrisy points to an aspiration that's not met, at least the aspiration remains. And I think that this is better than the alternative. Hypocrisy allows us to maintain pretenses, and the pretense reminds us that we're at least capable of being better than we actually are. And more to the point, that we should be better than we have been. Hypocrisy allows us to see the gap, and as long as we can see the gap, we can try to close it. That part is up to us. If we look at authoritarian regimes, they don't really have as much of a hypocrisy gap because let's be honest, most of us don't actually expect China to be better than it actually is. We know what China is. It's an authoritarian regime that doesn't have a higher moral aspiration. The same thing with Russia's interventions abroad as well. And you might say, well, oh, maybe that's better because at least what you see is what you get. But I would just posit to you that we have seen what anti-hypocrisy looks like in America. It's Donald Trump. Donald Trump has completely done away with any kind of moral language about what our aspirations are. He doesn't say anything about supporting democracy abroad. He doesn't say that human rights should be part of America's mission and how it conceives itself in its own foreign policy. And we see what that means. There are no pretenses. The mask is off entirely. Do we think that is actually better? With Donald Trump, you can't really call him out. You can't say, Donald Trump, why aren't you living up to your stated ideals? Because he doesn't have those stated ideals. At least under Biden, at least under every president before Donald Trump, we could at least call out our leaders and say, America has a distinct moral mission. We were founded as an ideological nation, and not ideological in the negative sense. Here I mean ideological in the sense of aspiring to a worldview that is beyond the traditional nation state. Most states don't have a worldview. Most states don't pretend to have a vision beyond the protection of their narrow national security interests. We do pretend. And that means we can always remind our leaders that we have a moral aspiration and that we can be better. And that's going to be my hope going forward as we rebuild American foreign policy. As I hope, not to say that everyone has to be partisan about it, but if Democrats are able to regain power in 2028 or 2032, there will be a process of rebuilding. And we're seeing how the Democratic Party is becoming more pro-Palestine, or at least more balanced and less unquestioningly pro-Israel. And we're seeing that with the fact that someone like Zohran Mamdani, who's one of the most prominent Democrats in the country now, was able to run and to be unapologetically pro-Palestine. And we're seeing more and more young Democrats, and the polling is very clear on this. They are trying to change U.S. foreign policy from within the Democratic Party. And this is the message I would offer to everyone here is don't exit the political system. Don't give up hope. America is worth fighting for and believing in. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Well, Shadi, thank you both for your great overview of your book. Obviously, you're the best placed person to do that, but also for uh, asking asking everyone to stay engaged in the political system. It's, I think, an importantly, especially important message in a university setting. So I will exercise moderator's prerogative and ask a question or two, and then anyone else wants to put a question, ask a question, just put it in the Q&A box, and we'll get to it. And the first question I have would be toward the end of at the very end of your discussion, you mentioned the 2028 or 2032 and alluded to the upcoming presidential campaign. And without asking you to name any names, I'm curious whether any political staffers for any prospective candidates or fellows at foreign policy think tanks that might be providing ideas or personnel to a follow-on administration have reached out to you and asked you to elaborate on your views, either in this book or other books or your columns.
Yeah. So first of all, I should say that I have a long history in think tanks. For about 14 years, I was at the Brookings Institution, which is just about as establishment as you can get. And I have to say that I've gotten disillusioned over the years with the role of think tanks. Um, I think they can still play an important role, but I worry that because they're so focused on being pragmatic and working within constraints, and I try to be pragmatic as well, but I think it's a question of where you are on the continuum. And I think there's a lack of boldness, there's a lack of creative thinking that often is a product of traditional think tanks because they want to maintain relationships with people in power, because they want to keep those lines open, and because they are trying to be as realistic as possible. That's part of their remit, is sometimes to tinker around the margins instead of offering a truly bold, transformative vision. So I would urge anyone who I talk to in think tanks, and I stay in touch with colleagues from who are in Brookings and other think tanks and so forth. And my feeling has always been we have to err on the side of boldness, that this is not a time for the old way of doing things, for kind of taking refuge in what was sometimes called the bipartisan foreign policy consensus. We have to break that consensus because that consensus failed. It led in part to the Iraq War, to the financial crisis, to the failures of the Arab Spring, to supporting autocratic regimes in the Middle East, something that I've been very critical of throughout my career. We've always fallen back on these old ways of doing things. So the way that I'm oriented now in terms of my own participation is to really say that something fundamental has to change. Something fundamental is rotten in our Middle East policy. We've supported dictatorships for the better part of 70 years, with a brief exception during the George W. Bush administration. And I give him some credit in my book that during the Freedom Agenda, which some of you might recall in 2004 and 2005, there was actually an effort to put pressure on some of our autocratic allies like Egypt. Granted, he didn't stay putting pressure on them, and he fell back on the old approach of supporting autocratic regimes in the name of stability, but you at least saw a glimmer of hope there. Barack Obama, for about 6 months after the Arab Spring started, was kind of optimistic about it. And then we saw him start to get disillusioned. And then he fell back on the old way of doing things, supporting autocratic regimes. So, the way that I'm thinking about the coming years is I'm going to offer advice, particularly to anyone who asks. I'm always happy to offer advice. But in terms of the kinds of candidates I want to support those who really are pushing the boundaries of what's possible and saying there has to be a fundamentally new approach. I actually worked for Bernie's foreign policy team in 2020. That's a nice little tidbit that I've been public about for a while, but people think it's kind of weird. like because people think that I'm hawkish and kind of interventionist. They're like, how are you working for Bernie in 2020? But I liked Bernie not because I agreed with him on everything, but because he was willing to challenge the status quo and come in with fresh ideas. And I think that's what we need. That's what will also help us win elections. If the goal is to win, I think American voters are fed up with people who come in with the old slogans and who aren't creative in their approach. And there was just this profile of Morris Katz, who's a close advisor to Zohran Mamdani, and it's worth reading as a profile for those of you who are interested. But he's 26 years old, and he's trying to get Democrats to have a different approach, to be more ambitious, to be more transformative, to be more creative. And I think those are the kinds of people who I hope will play more of a role in not just foreign policy decision making, but also in domestic policy, because I think the two are related. If you're not bold on foreign policy, you're probably not going to be bold on domestic policy and vice versa.
Thanks. Another question in the book's epilogue, very end of the book, you ask, I'm paraphrasing here, if you overshot the mark and whether your faith in America has been too uncritical. And that I was thinking of that when I read one of the questions my students sent, which I'll quote here. Does the argument for American dominance as preferred to the brutal authoritarianism of countries like China and Russia still hold true in light of recent events such as attacks on the media, attacks on universities, which potentially demonstrate a U.S. slide towards authoritarianism?
It's a good question. And I really wanted my doubts to be up front in the book, particularly in the epilogue, but it's also spread throughout the book because I don't think that people should be certain about their arguments. And I think a lot of books, people come out and they seem so certain in their argument, and you wonder, wait, did you wrestle with any of this? Did you struggle with your own convictions at any time? And I think we have to struggle. I think we have to question ourselves. And I go back and forth on some of these questions. And like I said, I wondered to myself, would I be comfortable telling my fellow Arab and Muslim Americans during what I consider to be a genocide in Gaza, would I be comfortable actually telling them to believe in American power? Could I actually do that in good faith? And I wondered about that. But what I would say is America, for all of its faults, even under Donald Trump, it still is a democracy. And I think we have to be very careful about drawing a moral equivalence between America under Trump and China or Russia. The very fact that we can have conversations like this, the very fact that I can criticize Trump without fear of persecution. Granted, not maybe everyone feels that level of freedom now, but I would say for the most part, most of us are comfortable criticizing Donald Trump if we're American citizens. If you're a foreign student, unfortunately, that has changed. And that's been a major shift in the in kind of the room that people in this country have to make criticisms of the Trump administration. But we still have the First Amendment, we still have the Bill of Rights, and that gives us a lot of room for maneuver, and quite frankly, more room for maneuver than you have in many European countries, which have cracked down even more aggressively on free speech, especially pro-Palestine speech. And we've seen that in countries like Germany and Britain and so forth, where even things that you say online can be used against you in a court of law. And for American citizens, we're not quite there yet. We'll have to obviously monitor that vigilantly, but we still have room to resist Donald Trump. And I have been heartened to see, especially in light of events in Minneapolis and elsewhere, that more Americans are saying enough is enough, and more Americans are taking to the street, and more Americans are calling out Trump for what he is. And that means that there's still room to work within the system. And the fact that you have so many young Democrats who are putting their hat in the ring to run for Congress or local office, again, it shows that there is room for maneuver. And that's what I would counsel in the end, that my book isn't just an argument about what is, it's an argument for being hopeful. Because I don't see what the alternative is. If we say that America is an autocratic regime, if we say that America is morally equivalent to China, then what's the point of even getting up in the morning? I wouldn't even do what I do. I wouldn't write. I wouldn't even want to be a writer. I'm a writer and I speak out and I speak to audiences like you because I want to make my case and I want people to believe in our better angels and to believe that America can actually be better. If we don't believe in that, then I think we're stuck.
Thanks. Earlier, uh, earlier in discussion, you were talking about the United States as a force for good, and you cited a number of post-war examples, liberation of Kuwait in 1991, the interventions in the Balkans in the 1990s. Not just those, but also you mentioned the spread of democracy in the 90s when the United States was arguably at its peak power, decline of battlefield deaths, and the like. And that leads to question from in the Q&A box, which I'll quote. Do you think the mainstream media and academics have generally been overly critical of the United States and its foreign policy? And the second question related to it, does that lead to Trump's rise since America is criticized even when it behaves decently?
It's a great question. And I think there is a real crisis in how Americans view their own country. And I have a chapter in the book that's titled Decline, where I go into some of this. I talk about a phenomenon that is called oikophobia, which is not very well known. It can be translated to, so we know about xenophobia, right? Which is the fear of what is foreign. Oikophobia is the fear of what is home, the fear of what is familiar. And I think that we have an oikophobia problem, especially on the left. Even as I was writing this book, I would tell people that I was writing it. But even before I was writing it, I would say things to people like, I love America. And I had, there's many instances where some of my white liberal friends in particular would look at me in amazement when I would say things like that. How can you, a person of color, a brown person, an Arab, a Muslim, how could you possibly use the word love to describe your attachment to America? And I think the very fact that saying things like that in some circles is seen as odd and unusual is an indictment, really, of where we're at as a country. And there was actually last year a poll that came out from Gallup. Some of you might have seen it. It's one of the most striking polling results I've ever seen. But in 2025, the number of Democrats who said that they were either extremely or very proud to be American was 36%. And just to give you some context, in 2004, that same number was at around 85%. So even after the Iraq War, 85% of Democrats were either extremely or very proud to be American. So we've witnessed a drop from 85% to 36% in the last 20 years. Something has happened. And some of that is tied to the woke era that we went in, dated from about 2014 to 2023, where it became normalized in our public discourse, especially on the left side of the spectrum, to have this kind of self-loathing, to have this kind of self-contempt. And I think that hurts progressives. It hurts Democrats because most American voters actually kind of like America, or at least they're open to liking it. So if we want to win, if we want to show people that there's a better way, if we want to be persuasive, we actually have to have a good opinion of our own country. And without that, I think we can be pushed to the side and dismissed as not serious or not hopeful or not upholding what America stands for, which is this sense of self-correction, of improvement, of progress. We have progressed in our history. We have America now is better than it was in the 1940s or 1950s. We're better than we were under Jim Crow. We're not as racially unequal today as we were back then. There are things that we can point to. So I think this narrative of perpetual doom is one that's not empirically accurate. And it also, I think, it also alienates a lot of people who would otherwise be sympathetic to a big part of the argument on the left, which I agree with, which is America has done very bad things in its history. Again, the Noam Chomsky critique, if you will. That catalog of sins that I was reading in the 2000s, those sins are real. We don't have to go into the whole list of how many democratically elected governments we helped overthrow during the Cold War. That happened. But I think that James Baldwin said that he said, I love something to the effect of, I love my country, and that's why I insist on the right to perpetually criticize it. The love of country can go hand in hand with the criticism of one's own country. And it's only recently that we've separated those two things and we say, oh, um, we don't like what our country is doing, therefore we can no longer love it. And I want to break that idea that those two have to go together.
Yeah, just to add to what you just said, I mean, the quotation "my country, right or wrong" is incomplete and therefore misleading. The full quotation is "my country, right or wrong, if right to support it, and if wrong to correct it." And I think that's important to bear in mind and consistent with the James Baldwin quote you just cited. We have a question, glad to see it's from an alumnus, who asks for more specifics, asking if you have some examples, and that's linked to a question I received from a student, which the student asks, what would responsible American leadership actually look like today beyond just military dominance?
Yeah, great question. And in the book, I disaggregate, if you will, the different kinds of power. When people hear the word power, I think they automatically think hard power. They think about military force, and that's a mistake. A lot of my book discusses soft power, cultural influence, diplomatic influence, putting pressure on autocratic regimes. We don't have to invade countries to help change them and push them on a better path. And that might sound neo-imperialist to change countries, but I very much believe that we should change countries. We should change countries that are autocratic. And if they receive $1.2 billion of US military aid like Egypt does, then we have every right to ask Egypt to meet minimal standards when it comes to human rights and political reform. And if it doesn't meet those standards, then I think it's perfectly within our right and reason to say, hey, maybe we'll withhold some of that aid. The same goes for, somewhat democratic countries like Israel, at least within its own borders, it still is somewhat democratic. And I think it's fair to ask Israel that, hey, you're supposedly one of our closest allies. If you are and you want to continue being one of our close allies, then we want you to stop killing as many people in Gaza. We want you to allow reconstruction aid to come in through the borders. We should be able to ask those things and put pressure on these governments to actually change their behavior. So when I think about a positive vision for American power, it's one where power is guided by morality, where power is not this thing of might makes right. I want to move us away from that idea of power. I want to actually bring back the idea of power, but carefully. I want to say that power is not something to be skittish about. Again, I think on the left, a lot of people are uncomfortable with the idea of holding power. And that's why generally a lot of left-wing folks, until recently, I would say, until the Bernie movement, AOC, and now Zohran Mamdani, I think there was a real discomfort with the idea of being in positions of power because power corrupts. And I think there's sometimes a tendency to want to be so morally pure and morally righteous that we wash our hands of American power altogether. We don't want to be in decision making. We don't want to play that role because that will compromise our own moral purity. But my argument is that morality and power can go hand in hand. It's actually morality that is necessary to guide our use of power. So my vision is one of America being truly a pro-democracy force in the world. And that means breaking the Middle East exception. After the Cold War ended, even towards the end of the Cold War in the 1980s, America started facilitating democratic transitions in Latin America, in Asia, in parts of Africa, in the Philippines, in South Korea, in Chile, in Guatemala. The list goes on. We had supported autocratic regimes in many of those countries, but we started, and credit where credit is due, first a little bit under the Carter administration, then more so under the Reagan administration. There started to be more of a focus on human rights and democracy. And that shows us that we can change over time. We can go from overthrowing elected governments to actually facilitating democratic transitions. We did that in most of the rest of the world, except for one region, the Middle East. The Middle East has remained in American foreign policy the exception that stands out like a sore thumb. This is where, as I've said before, with the exception of a brief period in '04, '05, and 2011, we have generally supported these brutal autocratic regimes. Now, does that mean that we should undermine them and force them out of power and again invade them or use military power? No. I'm under no illusions that Saudi Arabia is going to become democratic overnight. But we can put pressure on Saudi Arabia to at least be a little bit better in its human rights record. It can be part of a gradual change. And there's different ways of doing this, and it's risky. I understand that. But I don't see what the alternative is. The alternative is staying with authoritarian regimes. And I think that has shown that it hasn't worked out. The Middle East has been a font of instability, chaos, and civil war, despite the fact that we've been supporting these so-called stable authoritarian regimes. So what I want to do is close the gap between our rhetoric, between our moral aspirations, between what we say we want to be and what we actually are in the Middle East. And of course, there's a lot of room for improvement in places like Latin America, where we have facilitated democratic transitions, but we've also sometimes not done that. And I think Trump's record of this kind of Trump's newfound approach of being very aggressive in our own hemisphere, I think raises a lot of questions about what our Latin American policy can and should be as well. Sorry, Gordon, you're mute.
Sorry. You had mentioned earlier your views on think tanks, and we have a question here from someone in a think tank, not think tank slash advocacy group. And I'll just read it here. What is needed to educate the American public and to change U.S. foreign policy? Is it even possible in light of the huge influence of domestic and foreign lobbies and lobbyists defending and supporting the regimes?
Is it possible is a good question. And I've been on the losing side of this debate. I devoted much of the time from 2004 to more or less a year or two ago um, to Middle East policy first and foremost, before I started shifting away to touch on to write about a wider array of issues at the Washington Post. Um, my side of the debate lost. We tried really hard there, and I thought we made really good arguments during the Arab Spring, during the first freedom agenda under George W. Bush, but our policies are so entrenched that it's very difficult to change. And that's why you need visionary leadership at the top. we need to have one day, God willing, a president or a secretary of state or someone really at that senior, at that very, that senior most level who shares views like mine, let's say, on this question of supporting democracy abroad and putting pressure on these regimes. And my hope is that by making the arguments that I've made over the last 20 years, they will somehow filter up or filter down to someone young and ambitious who wants to run for office. There have been, I didn't know Mayor Pete in graduate school. I don't know how much like my ideas actually rubbed off on him, but it's possible. Like we don't know who we've been to school with or who we know socially on the level of friends, and we'll probably find out that some people that we know are going to run for office and have a potential to really change things and to change at least our public debate. I think Bernie's done a lot to move the Overton window on Israel Palestine. Before Bernie, there were very few people saying what he was saying, being unapologetically pro Palestine and calling for suspending aid to Israel or making aid conditional to Israel. Now that's become a mainstream view. Now more and more Democratic candidates are saying they won't take AIPAC's money. Something has changed. So yes, we are up against a lot. It's not going to be easy, but the fact that despite all of these roadblocks, all of these obstacles, we have seen a change in the public discourse over the last 2 years. Um, it it was remark. I mean, I was able with no pushback, no censorship, to write a pretty ambitious and serious article on calling out what was happening in Gaza as a genocide. That's allowed now, and the New York Times has had similar opinion pieces. It can be done, but what it needs is more organizing. What it needs is more people being in the political system. And what it requires is rich donors who are willing to support those kinds of causes. They're out there. It's a big country of 340 million people. There are multimillionaires and billionaires who I think are aligned with this vision. They haven't been brought into the system. They haven't been brought into this as much as they could be. But I do believe they're out there. In fact, I know they're out there.
So are you running for office, Shadi?
Thank you. Not quite. I think I mean people have brought that up sometimes, and I've thought everyone who's in the public debate sometimes like wonders whether they could be a good candidate for something. But I like writing. I'm not like the biggest people person. I'm not the kind of guy who will glad hand and shake hands with hundreds of people in one day. I get exhausted by politics too, I should say, even which is an odd thing to say for someone who writes about politics for a living. So I would like to live like a little bit more of a quiet life than being out there and being a candidate. But I would love other people to run for office if they're so inspired.
Just for the record, that's not a Sherman-esque refusal to ever run for office.
Right.
We'll see. Um, one of the students asks what principles should guide America in the future, and I think it's a very good question. But I'd like to see if you could at least at the start focus your comments on Iran. We saw, during in the wake of the 2009 protests in Iran, the President Obama decided against being very vocal in support of what the demonstrators were protesting for, because he didn't want to taint them by, creating a rally around the flag effect. In contrast, President Trump is, you know, possibly threatening military force. Carrier strike group has just moved back to the Middle East. Unclear what's going to happen. But anyway, with the question in mind of what principles should guide our foreign policy, how would you apply those in terms of supporting protesters in Iran?
Yeah, great question. It's also a tough one because with Iran, we have less levers. They're not an ally. We don't really have a real diplomatic relationship with them. So it's hard to see exactly what putting pressure on them means beyond rhetoric. I think we have to be very careful about trying to make a deal with this regime, and opening and keeping diplomatic channels open with them in the future after they've done and slaughtered thousands of protesters. I think there's a real question about whether we should, because I mean, Trump is odd. He threatens military strikes, but then he dangles open the possibility of a kind of rapprochement with the regime. So I think we have to be careful about in the future, if Trump changes, as he often does, of some kind of rapprochement with the regime, if it continues to kill its own citizens. If there was a hypothetical situation in which the US could use military force in a way that would actually help the protesters, I'd be open to a conversation about that. I just don't know how you do that effectively with a regime like Iran's. But if there was a way to have limited airstrikes that could provoke defections in the regime coalition, that's a very delicate thing to do. And I don't have the trust that a government and administration as heavy-handed as Donald Trump could do something so delicate. I worry that it would lead to real chaos and a rally around the flag effect, where a greater number of Iranians might rally around the regime if they come under American airstrikes that kill innocent civilians and so forth. So I feel like in that sense, I know what my moral sensibility is urging me towards, um, which is a more forthright stance. I just don't know exactly how you translate that into policy. I'm not an Iran expert. It's not something that I'm necessarily focused on as much. So it's very hard for me to come up with an alternative policy suggestion. Um, but there are great Iran people in various think tanks and in places like the Institute for Middle East Studies at GW, who I think could kind of speak better to that. But I think that we shouldn't forget about the protesters we who have been killed, and to we should find ways to lend our rhetorical support, but we also have to be careful to not promise too much. There's a risk sometimes when people are protesting when we say, "Hey, we're going to launch military strikes against regime targets if they keep on killing civilians." If we say that, that could encourage more people to protest. But if we're not willing to follow through on that threat, it's a kind of false hope that we're giving them. So again, a very delicate balance.
Let me ask a uh, question that a student posed in the Q&A box. Again, quoting, how can the American government exert soft power on countries whose populations do not want American influence in their nations?
Hmm. So I think the question is, why don't they want American influence in their nations? I think part of the reason is because they've seen the negative things that we've done. I mean, especially in the Middle East, where anti-American sentiment is and has been for a long time quite high. But I would argue that there's a risk of falling into a cycle. We say anti-American sentiment is high, therefore it's hopeless and we shouldn't do anything. But the very reason anti-American sentiment is high is because we've given up hope and not done anything. We've stayed with the status quo. So I think that there has to be a generations long struggle to shift public opinion in these countries where it's quite negative. And we do that by changing our policy. So, not just on trying to pressure these regimes to open up in the Arab world, but to have a more balanced policy on Israel Palestine. The fact that we have facilitated what Israel has done in Gaza has contributed to an uptick in anti American sentiment throughout the world, where they say, why is there one rule for Greenland or for Europe, and another rule for the global South or so-called third world countries. And I think we have to be more consistent on that. I think Mark Carney's speech at Davos was well received and it was pretty damn good. And I'm glad that someone was speaking those kinds of truths. But I think there's something ironic about Prime Minister Carney only saying this. He talks about the rules-based international order falling apart only after these threats against Greenland. Where was he over the past 2 years when we saw those threats against Gaza? So I think people see that hypocrisy gap, and that drives a lot of their cynicism towards the US. If we want to reduce that cynicism, again, what is the goal? We try to close that hypocrisy gap, also knowing that we're probably not going to close that hypocrisy gap altogether. There will always be some hypocrisy. But my preference is less hypocrisy is better than more hypocrisy.
We were talking about Iran before and tying it to soft power. Um, when I was serving in the Middle East and North Africa as an American diplomat, I was always humbled by the public opinion polls, which showed that are worth, but America's standing was highest in the region in Iran, and Iran was the only country where we did not have a diplomatic presence. And I think it does show how important American soft power is, and it shows how it's not necessarily often not a function of what the U.S. government does. It's what the people do. It's the culture. It's the relations between the diaspora and people in the country
Yeah.
and the like.
One thing I'll add very
Um,
quickly, Gordon, on that point,
yeah,
it just came to mind,
yeah,
which is when I was in Tahrir Square when Mubarak fell in February 2011, I saw up front how the protesters there were holding on to Obama's every word.
yeah.
They saw that we were capable of being better, and they were hoping for our better angels. And or even the Syrian opposition when they were being gunned down, or the Libyan opposition when they were being gunned down in 2011, they didn't turn to China or Russia for help. They were begging America to step in and do more because they knew that we stood for something beyond ourselves. So I find that oftentimes in the Middle East, in the Arab world, I should say, there's a love-hate relationship. You see hatred, but you also see this almost naive belief that America can be better. And they hold out hope in that. And that's why people were clapping when Obama made the speeches that led to Mubarak falling in
Mhm.
February 2011. I mean, we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah. I was in Tunisia at the start of the Arab Spring there, and one of the chants, and this during the demonstrations that led to Ben Ali's exile, was "Yes, we can." And never in my wildest dreams would I ever imagine an Arab protest with the chant of an American presidential candidate. But it shows that the power that the United States
Yeah.
can have to inspire people overseas. We've got time for one more question, and in some ways, this may be the most difficult question. And this is from a student, and I'll quote: "Is there a middle ground between the influence of American leadership and the authoritarianism of nations like China and Russia?"
Is there a middle ground? I tend to think that the differences between these regime types are, I have to say, irreconcilable. At some level, countries like China and Russia don't want to see democracy spread. They don't want, because that challenges their own domestic legitimacy. If they have neighbors that are democratic, then it raises the question of why can't China or Russia be democratic too? And this is
Mhm.
why China doesn't necessarily always actively support authoritarianism abroad, but it certainly doesn't support democratization. And it gives countries or encourages countries that it's allied with, including in Africa, advanced technology on facial recognition. This is something that China is trying to export. Um, China keeps a very close eye on Chinese citizens who live abroad. There is a real international component to China's own authoritarian proclivities. So I think at some level, there is an inherent tension. Does that mean we have to go to war with China? No. But it does mean that it's going to be hard to ever have a true rapprochement with China, a real partnership with them. I think it's difficult for democracies like ours to have real partnerships with autocracies like China's. We can work on mutual interests and we have to because China is going to be there. It's going to be the second largest power in the world behind us, which means that we can't completely ignore them or dismiss them or alienate them. There has to be some kind of constructive diplomacy that we do with them. But I think we have to be very careful about giving them advanced technology. And I'm very concerned about the Trump administration's recent decision to give advanced chip technology to license that to Chinese potentially to Chinese firms. I mean that makes me very concerned because China at the end of the day I don't think has benign intentions. And I think there's been a lot of good work done on this by people like Rush Doshi, for example. His book, The Long Game, I think lays out in a lot of clear detail that China actually has authoritarian ambitions beyond its own borders, and they are in fact playing a long game. So I would counsel real caution there. This idea that China can be made into a benign force under the current CCP leadership, I'm very skeptical of that.
Fortunately, that's all the time we have. I want to thank the audience for their questions. Sorry we didn't get to all of them. But in particular, I want to thank you, Shadi, both for writing the book and for such an interesting discussion on such a cold day. So thanks a lot, and we'll look for your campaign material down the road.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Gray. It was a real pleasure. And thanks to all of you for coming.